You forget something for 3 seconds and immediately start questioning your entire brain. Not because the memory disappeared, because for a moment you disappeared from your own thoughts. And sometimes it even happens in the smallest ways. You open your phone for a second and instantly forget why you did it. You just stand there holding it, like it might somehow return the thought back to you. You know that feeling. You walk into another room and suddenly your mind goes blank. You open your phone and forget why you picked it up. You start talking, and halfway through the sentence, the thought collapses in front of you. And the strange part is not that it happens, it is how physical it feels. Almost like the thought was right there a second ago, close enough to touch, then gone. And sometimes it even shows up in behavior you don't even notice anymore. You walk into a room, stop, and just stand there for a second, like the environment itself is supposed to remind you why you are there. Most people explain this the wrong way. They say attention span is getting worse, or maybe everyone is too distracted now. Or maybe this is just what stress does, but that explanation is incomplete. Because the real reason feels much stranger once you see it. Your brain is not losing thoughts randomly. It is deleting context, and you are living inside that process constantly without noticing it. And if you already feel strangely understood by this, stay with this video because the pattern behind it goes much deeper than memory. And if this already feels too familiar, subscribe now because this channel is built for people who constantly feel like their own mind is running deeper systems than they can explain. Not just in memory, in personality, in anxiety, in relationships, even in how stable you feel from moment to moment inside your own identity. Because the version of you that exists right now is far less stable than you think. Your brain rebuilds you continuously, and sometimes the reconstruction fails. That sounds dramatic until you realize how often it already happens. Think about this. You can be completely certain about something emotionally. Then 10 minutes later, in a different environment, your entire emotional state changes. You leave work and suddenly the pressure disappears. You enter your childhood home and instantly feel younger. You hear one song and memories you forgot for years come back fully intact, not fragments. Entire emotional realities. That is not nostalgia. That is context-dependent identity. And here's something even more noticeable if you pay attention. You can sometimes walk from one place to another and feel like a slightly different version of yourself without anything actually changing externally. That shift is real. Your brain does not store experiences like files in storage. It stores networks, sensations attached to locations, thoughts attached to emotional states, behaviors attached to environments. And most of the time, you mistake that system for a permanent self. But your brain is much more situational than you realize. This is why people make promises to themselves at night and break them the next morning. The person who decided was operating inside one emotional context. The person waking up exists inside another one. Same body, different neurological conditions. And sometimes you can even notice it in small, everyday moments. You wake up and immediately feel like certain thoughts from yesterday are harder to access. Like they belong to a slightly different version of you. And the scary part is this. You think consistency is natural? It is not. Consistency is actually a biological achievement. Your brain is constantly trying to stabilize an identity across changing environments, emotions, distractions, hormones, conversations, stress levels, sleep quality, and sensory input. That takes enormous energy, which is why your sense of self becomes weaker when your brain is overloaded. And overloaded brains do something very specific. They start dropping unfinished mental threads, that forgotten sentence, that lost idea, that task you swore you would remember. And you have probably experienced this in the most annoying way possible. You open a fridge and just stand there for a moment because the reason you came there simply vanishes. Your brain did not necessarily fail. It prioritized survival efficiency over continuity. That sounds intelligent until you realize how brutal the process actually is. Because your brain is willing to sacrifice parts of your conscious experience to preserve processing power, including thoughts you cared about deeply seconds ago. And this becomes more visible when your life feels mentally crowded. Not physically busy. Mentally crowded, those are different things. Some people have quiet schedules but loud internal systems, constant self-monitoring, constant prediction, constant emotional calculations running underneath every interaction. What should I say next? Did that sound stupid? What am I forgetting? Why do I feel off today? What if I missed something important? Your brain keeps dozens of invisible tabs open at once. And here's something you can test in your own experience. Even when nothing is happening externally, your mind can feel like it is running multiple background processes at once, like a system that never fully idles. And every one of those internal processes consumes working memory. Working memory is essentially your brain's temporary holding space. But here's the uncomfortable part. That space is tiny, much smaller than most people imagine. Your conscious mind feels vast, but the amount you can actively hold at once is shockingly limited. Which means every new stimulus competes against everything already happening inside your head. A notification, a facial expression, a random sound, one anxious thought, and suddenly the thing you were trying to remember gets pushed out, not erased, displaced. And that distinction is important because it changes how you interpret it. Because people often experience these moments as proof something is wrong with them. Especially intelligent people, especially self-aware people. They become scared of what it might mean about them. Why am I forgetting simple things? But unreliability is not always dysfunction. Sometimes it is overload. And overload creates strange psychological effects that people rarely connect together. For example, have you ever noticed how forgetfulness increases around emotionally complicated people? Not necessarily toxic people, complicated people. People who make your brain monitor itself constantly. Around them, your mind becomes fragmented. You lose words more often. You second-guess simple thoughts. You forget what you were about to say mid-sentence. That is not coincidence. Your brain allocates resources toward social prediction under uncertainty. And you can actually feel it in real time. A conversation that should feel simple starts to feel like a performance running in the background of your mind, which means some forms of forgetfulness are actually hidden stress responses. And this gets deeper, because stress does not only affect memory, it affects perception of time. This is why overwhelmed people often feel like entire weeks disappear instantly while individual days feel exhausting. Your brain stops encoding experiences properly when cognitive load becomes chronic. Memories become blurry because attention becomes survival-oriented. And here's something subtle but important. You stop fully experiencing moments. You start managing them instead. That distinction quietly changes a person over time, and many people live there for years without realizing it. They think adulthood just feels like this: constant mental noise, constant forgetting, constant low-grade exhaustion. And sometimes you only notice it when you suddenly get a moment of quiet and realize how loud everything usually is inside your head. But your brain was never designed for uninterrupted cognitive pressure. It was designed for cycles, focus and release, threat and recovery, attention and rest. Modern life removes the recovery phase, so your nervous system adapts by becoming selective. And selective brains appear forgetful. Now here's where this becomes deeply personal. The thoughts your brain drops are not random. It tends to discard whatever feels least immediately necessary for survival, which sounds logical until you realize what often gets sacrificed first. Creativity, curiosity, reflection, small emotional needs. People slowly lose access to parts of themselves while believing they are simply becoming more responsible adults. And if you think about your own experience, you can probably notice small signs of this. Moments where you wanted to think deeper about something, but your mind simply did not have space for it anymore. That is why so many people suddenly reconnect with themselves during vacations, late-night drives, long showers, or silent walks. And if you have ever had that moment where your thoughts suddenly feel clearer in the shower than anywhere else, that is not random either. It is the first time your brain stops prioritizing constant input, and hidden thoughts begin resurfacing, sometimes all at once. That is why your best insights rarely arrive while forcing them. They arrive after release. After pressure loosens slightly, your brain becomes searchable again. And there is another paradox hiding inside this. The harder you try to remember something, the less accessible it often becomes. You have experienced this. A name sits on the edge of your mind. You force retrieval harder and harder. Nothing happens. Then hours later, it returns effortlessly. This happens because stress narrows retrieval pathways. Your brain shifts from open associative processing into focused threat monitoring, which is useful if you are escaping danger. Terrible if you are trying to remember where you left your keys. Your nervous system cannot fully distinguish between physical urgency and psychological urgency. To your brain, social embarrassment can temporarily resemble danger. So the moment you panic about forgetting, your retrieval ability drops further. And this is where people usually start forming identity around it. They begin saying things like, "My brain is broken. I can never focus. I forget everything." But repeated experiences slowly become self-concepts. Your brain listens to the language you use about yourself, not emotionally, neurologically, because identity influences attention. Attention influences memory encoding. Memory encoding influences future identity. And the cycle reinforces itself constantly, which means many people are not trapped by poor cognition. They are trapped by repeated interpretations of normal cognitive overload. And once you see that, something changes in how you relate to yourself in those moments. Because there is something almost unfair about how modern life shapes this experience. You are expected to maintain perfect attention while processing more information in a single day than previous generations experienced in much longer periods of time. Your brain filters aggressively because it has to. and still you blame yourself every time something slips. But there is another layer underneath all of this, one most people never notice. Your brain remembers emotionally unfinished things differently. This is why unresolved conversations replay in your head for days, why awkward moments return at 2 in the morning, why emotionally incomplete experiences feel mentally louder than resolved ones. Your nervous system prioritizes unfinished emotional loops. So if your mind feels crowded constantly, it may not only be information overload. It may be unresolved internal threads running in the background, things you never fully processed, conversations you rehearsed but never had, versions of yourself you never became. And every one of those threads consumes mental bandwidth quietly. And this is also why people sometimes feel mentally exhausted after doing nothing physically demanding. Because internal processing is still processing, your brain burns energy managing invisible tension. And eventually that tension changes behavior. You become more distractible, more reactive, more emotionally numb, more dependent on external stimulation just to feel mentally engaged. Not because you became lazy, because overloaded systems seek relief. That relief often arrives through scrolling, noise, constant input, or distraction, which creates another problem. Your brain never fully consolidates experience anymore. Silence disappears, and without silence, your mind cannot organize itself properly. That is why some people feel uncomfortable the second things become quiet, because the backlog starts surfacing again. Thoughts return, emotions return. The things your brain kept postponing suddenly become audible again, and most people immediately escape back into stimulation. But this is where change actually begins, not through productivity hacks, through externalizing mental load instead of carrying everything internally. And if this is starting to make too many things in your life feel suddenly connected, take a second to like the video, not just for the algorithm, but because understanding this changes how harshly you judge yourself in those moments. People underestimate how powerful small structural changes are. Writing things down. People underestimate how powerful small structural changes are. Writing things down. Creating external systems, reducing unnecessary decisions, protecting sleep, reducing constant input. These are not small habits. They are cognitive load redistribution. Because every reduction in mental strain frees resources for awareness, emotional regulation, memory consolidation, and stable identity formation. Your brain functions differently when it is not constantly surviving its own backlog. And if this video feels uncomfortably accurate, subscribe now because this channel focuses on the hidden systems behind everyday human experience that most people misinterpret as personality flaws. And one of the biggest misunderstandings is this. People think mental clarity comes from becoming mentally stronger. Often it comes from becoming less cognitively fragmented. There is a difference. Strength alone does not solve overload. Capacity matters, recovery matters, environment matters, and the human brain, while adaptive, does not always adapt in ways that feel good. You can adapt to constant overload and still slowly lose connection with yourself in the process. That is what many people are actually describing when they say life feels unreal lately. Not depression exactly, not anxiety exactly. Fragmentation, too many unfinished threads, too much input, too little integration, and eventually the brain begins operating in short bursts instead of continuous experience. That is when days blur together. That is when you forget why you entered the room. That is when thoughts feel slippery, not because you are broken, because your system is saturated. And strangely enough, simply understanding this already reduces part of the pressure, because fear itself consumes cognitive resources. And the more afraid you are of forgetting, the more unstable attention becomes, which creates more forgetting. But self-understanding interrupts that cycle, and maybe this is the deepest part of all of it. Your brain is not trying to ruin your life, it is trying to protect processing capacity in an environment that constantly exceeds it. Imperfectly, sometimes frustratingly, but intelligently. And the thoughts that disappear mid-sentence, the reason you walked into a room, the idea that returns hours later in the shower. They are not failures, they are side effects of a system trying to stay functional under load. Which means maybe the real question was never, why do I keep forgetting things? But instead, how much am I forcing my mind to carry alone? And if that hit harder than expected, tell me in the comments what is the strangest thing your brain has ever completely forgotten for no reason. Because the more people talk about it, the more obvious it becomes that none of us are experiencing this alone. And if your mind has been carrying too many unfinished threads lately, there is more here that explains what that actually does to memory, identity, and emotional stability over time.